There are stories whispered through the pages of Southern history, stories wrapped in silence, shame, and shadows. But few are as unsettling, or as revealing, as the scandal that once rippled across Magnolia Ridge, one of the grandest plantations in the antebellum South. Most tales from that era focus on battles fought and fortunes made. But behind every polished veranda and white-columned mansion was another world, one where power determined truth. And truth was buried the moment it became inconvenient. Our story begins there, beneath a sky heavy with humidity and secrets, on an estate owned by the Harrow family, one of the oldest and most feared families in the region. Magnolia Ridge was known for its wealth, its sprawling lands, its endless fields of cotton and sugarcane. But those who lived in the nearby town of Port Dalton whispered another rumor, one that the Harrows could not buy their way out of. They said the plantation master, Thomas Harrow, carried a shame deeper than any scar on his reputation, a weakness he hid behind a stone-cold glare and a rigid spine, a flaw he believed no real man should possess. They said he could not produce an heir, no sons, no daughters, no future to continue the Harrow name. And in a world where legacy meant everything, this was not just a personal failure, it was a death sentence for the entire family line. Inside the grand house, with its chandeliers and polished floors, lived Charlotte Harrow, Thomas's young wife. At first glance, she seemed the picture of Southern grace, poised, refined, and elegant. People admired her beauty, envied her dresses, and whispered that before she married Thomas, she could have wed any man she desired. But Charlotte had learned quickly that being a plantation mistress was not the dream she'd imagined. She was expected to smile without faltering, host without complaining, and bear an heir without hesitation. And it was that last duty, the one she could not fulfill, that consumed her days and haunted her nights. Charlotte had suffered in silence for years, believing that she was the barren one. She endured the shame, the hushed gossip, the judgmental glances from other plantation wives who measured a woman's worth by the children clinging to her skirts. But one stormy night, while servants rushed to secure the shutters, Charlotte discovered the truth. A truth Thomas had hidden from her since the day they married. A truth that shattered everything she thought she knew. Thomas's infertility was not a rumor. It was real. And he had known all along. Charlotte felt something inside her break. Not merely trust, but the illusion that she still had control over her life. That she still had a purpose in the world beyond decorative expectation. Because in the antebellum South, a wife without children was not simply pitied. She was disposable. But Thomas did not care about her feelings. He cared about his reputation. And he expected Charlotte to continue pretending. To lie, to smile, to shoulder the blame that belonged to him. And that was the moment right there in her candlelit bedroom, as thunder rumbled outside, that the seed of defiance first took root in Charlotte Harrow. A quiet rebellion. A spark of desperation. A thought she shoved aside at first, refusing to let it take shape. But it grew. And grew. And grew. While Thomas obsessed over keeping his secret hidden, Charlotte began to look at the estate with new eyes. She noticed the hierarchy, the brutality, the quiet resilience of the people forced to work the land. She realized that every soul on that plantation lived under Thomas's iron grip, including her. And yet, as oppressive as her world felt, Charlotte knew she still held something Thomas did not. Choice, or at least the illusion of it. And it was that illusion that brought her to the edge of a decision that would soon ignite a scandal so large, so shocking that even the walls of Magnolia Ridge seemed to tremble under its weight. For somewhere within the fields, in the heat and dust and hardship, lived a man who would change her fate. A man who did not yet know he would be pulled into the Harrow family's darkest secret. But before his name is spoken, before his life is forever entwined with Charlotte's, you must understand this. Nothing about what was coming was simple. Nothing was romantic. Morning sunlight crept across Magnolia Ridge, stretching long shadows over the fields as the enslaved workers began another day under the watchful eye of overseers. But on this particular morning, something in the air felt different, an uneasiness. A tension that seemed to ripple across the plantation like a silent warning. Charlotte Harrow stood at her bedroom window, watching the distant figures move through the fields. Her mind drifted through the fragments of the secret she had discovered: Thomas's infertility, the years of blame she had carried, and the growing realization that her own future teetered on a fragile edge. She needed an heir. That was the expectation. That was the duty. That was the only thing the world demanded from her. And now, she knew that her husband could not provide it. The thought she had tried so hard to suppress returned once again, whispering to her like a ghost, there may be other ways. But such ideas were dangerous and thinkable. Even imagining them was enough to risk everything. Still, Charlotte found her gaze drifting toward the fields, toward the people whose lives were never their own, toward the men whom Thomas viewed as property rather than human beings. She hated the system she lived inside, yet she was also trapped by it, bound by rules she had never created, but was forced to obey. And that was when she first noticed him, Samuel. He stood taller than the others, his posture straight even after hours of back-breaking labor. His muscles moved with strength and discipline, but his expression, calm, unreadable, steady, set him apart. Samuel carried himself with a dignity that defied his circumstances, silent resistance that did not need words to be understood. Charlotte had seen him before, of course, but never really studied him. Never allowed herself to wonder about the person behind the labor, the man beneath the chains of a system built on cruelty. But now, as she watched him, one undeniable truth surfaced. Thomas would never choose Samuel for anything except labor. But fate, circumstances, and desperation had made Samuel impossible for Charlotte to ignore. The idea frightened her, not because of Samuel himself, but because of what it meant to even consider involving him in the Harrow family's darkest problem. Meanwhile, down in the fields, Samuel felt the weight of watchful eyes. He was used to being observed by overseers, scrutinized for strength, endurance, obedience. But this felt different. A sensation like a presence lingering, evaluating. Deciding, Samuel tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on his work. But the sense of something approaching something inevitable hung over him like a storm cloud ready to burst. That afternoon, as the sun bled into the horizon, Charlotte found herself pacing the hallway of the grand house. Her footsteps echoed across the polished floors, each tap of her heel punctuating the battle inside her mind. She knew the risks. She knew the consequences. She knew that involving Samuel, no matter how carefully or quietly, would place them both in unimaginable danger. Yet the alternative was worse. Without an heir, Thomas's relatives, wealthy, vicious, and eager to seize the plantation, would descend upon Magnolia Ridge like vultures. Charlotte would be cast aside, penniless and disgraced. And the people on the plantation, including Samuel, would be sold off to new masters, many far crueler than Thomas. For the first time, Charlotte realized that her decision would affect not only her future, but the fate of every soul living on the land. That evening, as lanterns flickered in the corridors and the house grew quiet, Charlotte did something she had never done before. She asked a servant to summon Samuel to the veranda. It was an order that would be questioned by anyone who heard it. No one dared disobey the mistress of Magnolia Ridge. Word traveled quickly. Carried by hushed whispers and nervous glances, Samuel wiped the sweat and dirt from his brow, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. He had never been called to the veranda. Not once. Not for punishment. Not for discussion. Not for anything. He climbed the wooden steps slowly, unsure of what waited for him on the other side of the tall white doors. When he reached the top, he saw her standing alone, the woman whose gaze had followed him earlier. Charlotte, their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world stilled. She took a quiet breath, steadying her trembling hands. She was about to speak words that would change both of their lives forever. But before the conversation began, before the plan formed and fate tightened its grip, there was only silence. And in that silence lay the weight of every consequence that was still to come. If this twisting scandal of Magnolia Ridge hit like, share this video. And subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what do you think Charlotte will ask Samuel when they finally speak face to face? The veranda of Magnolia Ridge stretched out over the fields, its white columns gleaming in the fading light of dusk. The distant hum of cicadas filled the air, and somewhere far below, the enslaved workers were finishing the day's grueling labor. But here, in this elevated space, the world seemed to narrow to only two people, Charlotte Harrow and Samuel. Charlotte's hands were folded neatly in front of her, but they trembled slightly. Her breathing was measured calm on the surface, yet inside, a storm raged. Every step she had taken to reach this moment, the years of silence, the growing knowledge of her husband's infertility, the fear of losing everything, culminated in this impossible conversation. Samuel approached slowly, his eyes steady, wary, yet aware that something monumental was about to happen. He had no way of knowing what awaited him. He only knew that the mistress of the plantation, the one whose authority could control every aspect of his life, had summoned him privately. And in the world of Magnolia Ridge, private summons was never good. Charlotte cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel, I need to speak with you about something important. Something that concerns both of our futures." He nodded once, attentive but cautious. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, keeping his tone respectful. Careful not to betray the unease that churned in his stomach, she looked away toward the horizon, as if searching for courage in the fading light. "Thomas, my husband. He cannot father a child, and if we cannot produce an heir, the plantation will be taken from me, and everything we've built will be lost." Samuel's brow furrowed. He had seen the power structures of this world up close. He knew what this meant for her, but for him, he didn't yet understand the full danger that loomed. Charlotte's eyes met his, and in them, Samuel saw desperation. A desperation that was almost palpable. She continued, "I cannot rely on Thomas to solve this, and yet, I cannot allow the plantation and all the people here, all of you who rely on it, to fall into ruin. That is why I must make a choice that is dangerous, that is unconventional." Samuel's heart quickened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. He sensed what she was implying, but he forced himself to remain silent. Listening was safer. Understanding came later. Charlotte took a deep breath. "I need someone strong, someone capable, someone who can carry forward what Thomas cannot. And you, Samuel, you have the strength, the intelligence, and the resilience that this plantation, that this family needs. I need you to help me secure the future of Magnolia Ridge." She paused, the weight of her words hanging heavily between them. Samuel's mind raced. He understood the layers of danger. Refusal could bring wrath. Compliance could compromise his very dignity and autonomy. And yet, the alternative, the uncertainty of the plantation falling into cruel hands, terrified him as well. Charlotte spoke again, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "I cannot do this alone. And you may not understand yet, but this is not simply about me. It is about everyone here. I am asking you to take a role in this, to help me, to protect what we cannot afford to lose." Samuel remained silent, digesting the enormity of her request. It was not a conversation of equals, he understood that, but it was the first time anyone in his life had addressed him with recognition beyond mere labor. The first time anyone had seen him as capable, as important, as necessary. He wanted to respond, to assert himself, to ask questions that could never be asked aloud. But he sensed the fragile balance of power in this conversation, and he chose caution. For now, Charlotte stepped back, her hands folded once more, trembling but resolute. "Think carefully, Samuel. Whatever choice you make, it will define both our futures." For a long moment, they stood in silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red, as if the heavens themselves were marking the weight of the moment. And in that silence, Samuel understood something vital. Whatever happened next, Nothing would ever be the same again, because this was no ordinary arrangement. This was a choice that defied every rule, every expectation, every moral boundary of the antebellum South. And as Charlotte and Samuel prepared to navigate its consequences, unseen eyes were already beginning to watch, waiting to exploit any misstep, any weakness. If you felt the tension rising in, hit that like button and share this story with friends. Subscribe so you won't miss, or secrets start unraveling, and the consequences of Charlotte's choice begin to take shape. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you were Samuel, standing in his shoes? Night had fallen over Magnolia Ridge, and the plantation house seemed to hold its breath. Shadows stretched across the polished floors, flickering in the light of a single oil lamp. Somewhere beyond the windows, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying the distant rhythm of cicadas and the occasional cry of a night bird. Inside, Charlotte Harrow sat in her private parlor, her hands folded on her lap. She had summoned Samuel to the veranda earlier that evening, and the weight of their conversation lingered like a storm cloud. Every word she had spoken replayed in her mind. Every hesitation, every pause, every unspoken implication. She understood no more clearly than ever that she had stepped into dangerous territory. One misstep, one wrong word, and everything she had fought to protect could crumble in an instant. The plantation, the people, even her own life, it all rested precariously on choices that defied the rules of her society. But Charlotte was not the only one paying attention. Thomas Harrow, her husband, had always been meticulous. Cruel, yes, but meticulous. He noticed everything, from a servant's nervous glance to the faintest change in Charlotte's composure. And tonight, he noticed something different, something that set his instincts on edge. Charlotte's steps, usually confident and deliberate, carried a tension that Thomas could not ignore. The soft sounds of her voice as she spoke to herself or two unseen companions reached his ears, and then the unmistakable sign that confirmed his suspicion, a shadow moving outside the veranda. Just beyond the glow of lanterns, Thomas's fury was slow to ignite, but once it did, it consumed him entirely. He paced the hall, his boots echoing against the polished floor. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had observed. There was no doubt in his mind Charlotte was hiding something. Something significant. Something that could humiliate him, threaten his control, and tarnish the Harrow name forever. Meanwhile, Samuel, unaware of Thomas's scrutiny, lingered in the fields near the veranda. Trying to make sense of the evening's events, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, a burden unlike any he had known. The choice Charlotte had presented was not a favor, it was a trap wrapped in necessity. One wrong word or action could unleash the full wrath of a man who tolerated no challenge, no defiance. And Thomas, with his suspicion growing like wildfire, was ready to act. He followed the faint creak of floorboards down the hallway, each step calculated, silent, precise. His hand rested on the banister as he peered into the dimly lit parlor. And there it was, the conversation he had dreaded, but half expected. Charlotte's figure alone, moving in ways that suggested a plan, a scheme, secret that could destroy him. Anger and fear collided in Thomas's chest. He could not allow this. He would not. And yet, he hesitated for the briefest of moments, considering his options. To confront Charlotte now would be dangerous rash. To wait, to watch, to understand fully, that might give him the upper hand he needed. In the silence, the tension thickened. Every heartbeat, every whisper of wind, every flicker of lamplight seemed amplified, carrying the weight of impending disaster. Samuel's presence, Charlotte's choices, Thomas's growing suspicion, they were all threads in a web tightening with every passing moment. And then the first misstep occurred. A servant, unsuspecting and unaware of the stakes, dropped a tray in the kitchen below. The clatter echoing like a gunshot through the house. Thomas froze, ears straining. Charlotte flinched, almost imperceptibly. Samuel's pulse raced, unaware that the smallest sound had the power to reveal their secret. In that instant, everything changed. Thomas knew something was happening, something he had never anticipated. And he would not wait. He would act. And when he did, The consequences would ripple through every life on Magnolia Ridge, touching Charlotte, Samuel, and every soul bound to the land under their shadow. The night held its breath. The cicadas fell silent, and the plantation seemed to wait for the storm to break. What Thomas discovered in the shadows that night would ignite a chain of events no one could control, no one could escape. I've left you on the edge of your seat. Hit like and share this story. Subscribe to follow the scandal unraveling at Magnolia Ridge. And tell me in the comments, what do you think Thomas will do next? Will he destroy Charlotte's plan, or will he underestimate her cunning? The tension at Magnolia Ridge had reached a breaking point. The quiet, creeping dread that had haunted Charlotte for weeks now settled like a weight on every corner of the plantation. Every shadow, every whisper, every glance carried potential danger. And at the center of it all stood Charlotte herself, poised and resolute. Yet trembling under the weight of the secret she had initiated, Thomas Harrow was no longer the unaware master of the house. He had followed the shadows, he had heard the hushed conversations, and he had begun to piece together what Charlotte was attempting. Anger simmered in him like molten metal, and every day that passed without confrontation only intensified his fury. But Charlotte, cunning and desperate, had anticipated his suspicions. She knew Thomas's pride, his obsession with reputation, and, most importantly, his underestimation of her intelligence. She had to act before he did, and act she did. Late one evening, when the house was hushed and the servants had retired to their quarters, Charlotte summoned Thomas to the main parlor under the guise of a social discussion. An ordinary matter concerning the estate's operations. Thomas, his curiosity piqued, and his ego convinced that he could uncover any secret he chose, agreed. Charlotte's voice was calm, almost serene, as she spoke. "Thomas, we need to talk about the future of Magnolia Ridge," she began, her tone deceptively neutral. "About what is at stake if decisions are left unchecked." Thomas frowned, suspicion furrowing his brow. "What are you implying?" he demanded. "Speak clearly, Charlotte. I do not have patience for riddles." She let a small, almost imperceptible smile cross her face. "I am speaking of the estate itself, of the people who live and work here, of the legacy of the Harrow name, and, Thomas, of the truth that cannot remain hidden forever." Thomas stiffened. His pulse quickened. He could sense the gravity in her words, but he could not yet see the trap she had prepared. Charlotte was laying the foundation carefully, drawing him into a web from which he could not escape without revealing himself. "You speak in riddles?" Thomas spat, his voice edged with fury. "What truth? What are you trying to hide behind these words?" Charlotte's gaze did not waver. She looked at him with the calculated confidence of someone who knew precisely what leverage she held. "I am speaking of a future, Thomas, that cannot rely solely on appearances. A future that requires acknowledgement of certain limitations." His face hardened, realizing that she was referencing his inability to father an heir. His pride, which had shielded him for years, now became a weapon against him. He could see the brilliance in her strategy, even as it left him vulnerable. Charlotte continued, "I cannot depend on you to continue the Harrow name, but I can act to preserve the estate. I can ensure the safety of those who live here, and that includes Samuel Land, intelligent, capable man who understands the land and its people." Thomas's fury exploded, but it was controlled. He could not publicly lash out without risking his reputation. Yet in the privacy of the parlor, his rage burned hotter than the summer sun. He realized that Charlotte had taken the initiative. She had exposed his secret, manipulated circumstances, and asserted her authority in ways that defied every rule he believed governed their lives. In that moment, Thomas understood that the power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the absolute authority. Charlotte had not only secured control over the plantation's future, but it also forced him into a corner, where any action would carry consequences far beyond what he had ever imagined. And Samuel? He remained cautious, aware of the delicate balance he now occupied. He was neither free nor entirely trapped. The arrangement Charlotte proposed was fraught with moral and social danger. Yet it was also a lifeline for him, for Charlotte, and, in some sense, For the plantation itself, the consequences of Charlotte's power were only beginning to unfold. The whispers among the other plantation owners, the subtle attention of neighbors, and the unspoken knowledge among the enslaved workers created a ripple effect that would reach far beyond Magnolia Ridge on yet. Even with her triumph, Charlotte could not escape the gnawing sense of cost. Every choice she had made, every manipulation, every secret kept, carried a price, one that would echo through the lives of everyone on the estate, leaving scars that would last for generations. The question now was no longer if her plan would succeed, but at what cost. And soon, the consequences would arrive in a form no one could anticipate. If you on the edge of your seat, hit like, share this video, and subscribe so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion. And tell me in the comments, do you think Charlotte's choices were justified, or was she stepping too far? The sun rose slowly over Magnolia Ridge, casting long shadows across the cotton fields and bathing the white columns of the mansion in gold. On the surface, the plantation appeared peaceful, as though the events of the past weeks had never occurred. But behind the walls, beneath the polite appearances, a storm of consequences was still brewing, a storm that would change the lives of everyone on the estate forever. Charlotte Harrow moved through the corridors with the quiet precision of someone who had mastered both fear and calculation. The secrets she had woven into the lives of those around her were like threads in an intricate tapestry, each one delicate, yet each one holding immense weight. Every glance, every whisper, every careful gesture now mattered. Samuel, the man whose strength, dignity, and intelligence had captured Charlotte's attention, remained cautious. Though he had agreed to assist Charlotte, the arrangement was far from simple. He understood that he was not free, even in this temporary balance of power. Every day he spent at Magnolia Ridge was a test, one that demanded vigilance, patience, and courage. Thomas Harrow, meanwhile, had been forced to confront a reality he could neither control nor ignore. Charlotte had exposed his secret, asserted her authority, and manipulated the circumstances in ways that left him powerless. His pride had been shattered, his dominance challenged, and his ability to dictate the future of Magnolia Ridge irrevocably compromised. For the first time in his life, Thomas realized that his reputation and power were not absolute, and yet, even as Charlotte gained control of the estate, she could not escape the gnawing sense of guilt and doubt. Every decision she had made, every manipulation, every calculated risk, carried a moral cost. She had acted out of necessity, but necessity does not absolve conscience. She had forced Samuel into a role he had not chosen, and the weight of that reality pressed on her relentlessly. As the days passed, Samuel began to plan his own escape. He had seen the way Charlotte's power shifted the balance on the plantation, but he also knew that true freedom lay beyond the boundaries of Magnolia Ridge. He began quietly communicating with others who were traveling north, organizing a path that might lead him to safety, away from the shadows of a life he had never chosen. Charlotte, when she learned of Samuel's intentions, did not stop him. In her heart, she understood that he deserved autonomy, even if it meant losing her carefully orchestrated plan. For the first time, she faced the full truth of her actions, the choices she justified, the lines she had crossed, and the consequences she could not control. The day Samuel left, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte watched him disappear into the horizon, carrying with him not only the hope of a new life, but also the weight of a history that had been intertwined with hers. It was a departure marked by silence, by understanding, and by the acknowledgement that some bonds, no matter how forced or complicated, cannot be undone, even when distance separates them. Years later, after the fall of slavery, whispers returned to Magnolia Ridge. Samuel had survived, built a life far from the estate, and raised a family that would never know the chains of the past. Charlotte remained on Magnolia Ridge, her legacy intact in property but tarnished in spirit. The plantation survived, but at a cost that lingered in every creaking floorboard, in every corner of the grand house, in the memory of every decision that had been made in secrecy. Charlotte had wielded power with skill, but she had also learned that power always exacts a price. Survival, legacy, and control may have been hers to claim, But freedom, trust, and innocence were not. She lived her life in a gilded cage of her own making, a ruler of a world built on compromise, strategy, and moral ambiguity. And so, the story of Magnolia Ridge ends not with triumphant victory, but with reflection. A story of ambition and desperation, of manipulation and consequence. A story that reminds us that every choice carries weight and every act, no matter how justified it may seem, leaves an imprint on the lives of those around us. If this story of secrets, power, and survival at Magnolia Ridge captivated you, hit like, share it with friends, and subscribe for more dramatic historical stories. And tell me in the comments, what do you think of Charlotte's choices? Was she a cunning survivor, or did she cross a line that could never be forgiven?